Thank you, Chris, for coming here today to speak with us. So do you want to tell us a little bit, just to start out, about your book, about the roots of war and the paths to peace?
Sure. So all of War and Peace in 2 minutes.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe 3.
Exactly. So partly this is a book. It's not really about my ideas. It was a book born of frustration that I think there were all these things I might have learned 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. I think the ideas are that old, that had rotated my brain 90 degrees about why we fight. And I would talk to people in government in a developing country. I would talk to people in the Pentagon. I would talk to my mom, and nobody was aware of these things. And so this was me trying to bring together all these lessons from all these different social sciences and all these different practitioners. And the first lesson is actually that most of the time we don't fight. Which seems like a weird thing to say at this moment, when it feels like we're on the verge of World War III with at least two rivals in the world. But it's true, 999 times out of 1,000, whether it's nations or gangs or ethnic groups, they don't fight. I like to say enemies prefer to loathe in peace, and the reason for that is because war is ruinous. It's just ridiculously costly. You can look at the war that's happening today in Russia, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and not only has Ukraine's economy shrunk by half, and not only are there cities that are bombed out and all of the deaths, not only has Russia set itself back 20 years economically and increased repression, but everybody in the world is paying more for their fuel and more for their food, and a lot of those people can't afford it. So it's ridiculously costly, and so most of the time we avoid it. And so the short answer to why we fight is it's a reason that either a leader or a society ignored those costs. And then the book is about what social science tells us is that there's really just 5 main ways that happens, which we can get into. But that's, if people remember nothing else, it's like we fight because we overlook these costs of war, or we're willing to pay them. And so we have to start there.
So one of the things that really stood out to me about the book was its scope. You talk about, war on the scale of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also conflict on smaller scales, gang violence and stuff like that. And I wouldn't have, before I read the book, necessarily have thought to group those as the same phenomenon. And I'm curious sort of what set the scope for you when you're writing about this.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a political scientist and an economist, and your job in theory as a social scientist is to specialize, and so you're supposed to become a specialist on gang conflict or civil war, or maybe a particular type of civil war even, and then you refine your understanding because all of these things are different, and it's true. But what I found, and that's what I worked on gang conflict. I work in Chicago, I work in Medellin, Colombia, I work in Mexico, and prior to that I worked on ethnic conflict and civil war in Africa for many, many years. And I found that the things I was learning to understand why 2 villages go to war or 2 political factions go to war, I had a lot to learn from all of the lessons I'd learned in graduate school about why nations go to war. And a lot of the things that worked at the international level or worked at the local level worked because they were tackling the same causes of war. And I felt we could learn a lot from one another. So yes, they're super different. And I make some of my social scientist colleagues mad by mingling these things in the same book. But actually they share a lot in common, and I think we learn a lot from those similarities.
All right. And the 5 causes where a country or a gang or a group ends up ignoring the reasons to not go to war. What are those? So, when you talk about a book for 6 months, you come up with better labels than you come up with before you talk about it in front of groups of people. So now I like to think of it, because as I think of it, it's when a leader or society is unaccountable, ideological, biased, uncertain, or unreliable. And let me just use this Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, I think, on a lot of people's minds. So let me use that as an illustration. Unaccountable. So leaders who are not checked or not accountable don't pay a lot of those costs of war. The extreme version is an autocrat, especially a personalized dictator, like Vladimir Putin. So they don't have to take into account many of the costs of war because they don't bear them.
And what's more, when a political leader thinks that they can strengthen their power or preserve their regime by fighting, that's a private incentive to fight. And so even if it's against the wider interests of the group, as it almost always is, if you think that, say, exterminating a democratic flame on your borders amongst a people that your people identify with more than anybody else on the planet makes you a little bit likelier to stay in power, well, that's an added incentive to do so. So that's unaccountable. Ideological. This is the story you hear in the newspaper about a President, Vladimir Putin, who's either obsessed with personal glory or obsessed with national glory and getting the empire back together, or rectifying past humiliations, right? There's lots of these stories, and to the extent they're true, and I think they're partly true, that's a story of he's aware of the costs, and he's willing to pay them for some ethereal or ideological objective that he only gets through war. And it helps, by the way, that he's only accountable for a shred of those costs, and so he's readier to do so. The other story you hear in the newspaper is the biased. You hear about an isolated, insulated dictator who was getting bad information, which is a classic problem of autocracy. It's also a classic problem of democracies. So people trace the U.S. invasion of Iraq to intelligence failures. Well, the intelligence failures and that institutional bias often accentuates itself in autocracies. And so this is maybe why he and his advisors seem to have been so convinced that this would be straightforward. But leaders also have capacities to be psychologically biased and overconfident and to misjudge their enemies. And so that's a whole cluster of reasons as well. The thing is what you don't hear so much about are the last two, this uncertainty and unreliable, which are the more subtle strategic ones, but I think are arguably as or more important. In order to be biased, the truth has to be uncertain, right? You can't get it wrong if everything's known. But the uncertainty itself is a problem. So if you think back to 7 months ago, how uncertain it was, how plucky and capable the Ukrainians would be, especially their military, how effective the Russian forces would be, and how unified the West would be on sanctions. And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three was within the realm of possibilities, but nobody predicted it, least of all Vladimir Putin. And so amidst this uncertainty, it's possible to get it wrong and then to be compelled to gamble on invading or not, and to gamble wrong. This also sets up like a really important strategic dynamic, which is where, well, nobody wants to be invaded, so you ought to be able to signal, hey, we're super strong, we're very resolved. But you can never trust that because you're worried they're bluffing. And so it's a little bit like a hand of poker. You understand the strategic dynamics and the optimal strategy, if you've ever played poker, which is to say, it's never optimal to bluff all the time when the truth is uncertain, and it's never optimal to bluff some of the time, none of the time. You bluff, it's optimal to bluff some of the time. Likewise, amidst that uncertainty, it's never optimal to fold all the time, it's never optimal to call all the time. It's optimal to call or invade some of the time. And so it becomes probabilistic, it becomes an optimal strategy to take the risk of invasion. And you do so because then it deters, it reduces the incentive to bluff. The last thing is, the last story you hear, and maybe one of the most important ideas in conflict is this idea of your rival is unreliable, or what a political scientist or an economist would call a commitment problem. And this is the idea that you just can't trust them to uphold a deal. There's a deal that makes you both better off because you don't destroy a share of the pie before you fight over it, before you split it, rather. But you can't trust them to uphold that peaceful split. You think they're going to renege in future, maybe because they're going to be more powerful in future. I think this is less important in the case of Russia and Ukraine, but it's certainly probably true in understanding the timing of this war. So why now? Arguably, Russia was at its peak leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine. It was economically stagnating. Ukraine had nowhere to go but up, and it was growing inexorably closer to the West, to Europe. It was acquiring drones, it was acquiring its own missiles, and so it was never going to get any easier. So there was a certain now or never element of locking in the present advantage. And that is your first step towards a commitment problem. So those are the five, but we could use that to understand conflict at all sorts of levels. Sometimes a few of the five are present, sometimes all. Unfortunately, you don't need that many.
Did you run across any cases that didn't quite fit this analysis, and none of those five factors seem to really be driving the fight?
So It's, one of the trickier situations is when you end up with lots and lots of actors competing in society. So you could think about a balance of power problem amongst many global powers. Or you could go to the Eastern Congo and you could find yourself amidst dozens of armed groups. Or you could go to the city of Chicago or the city of Medellin, you could find dozens of armed groups. This idea that, this core idea that we mostly don't fight because it's costly makes sense when you have two adversaries. Mm-hmm. That if you're evenly matched, if we're sort of fighting over this table, mm-hmm. right, we could either, and we're roughly evenly matched, we could kind of split it roughly in half, or we could destroy a share of it and then one of us gets it. Flip a coin to see who gets it. So we don't want to destroy the table. We'd rather split an undamaged pie. When you get, and that's clear, that's like one of the basic lessons of game theory. As soon as you add a third or fourth or fifth person, though, that can fall apart. And so that brings us to a level of complexity. And so as a result, actually what's interesting is because that's such a problem, you'll usually find that when you get a city full of gangs, they actually try to form confederations and alliances so that they have this bilateral bargaining. And rebel groups and insurgents almost tend to form coalitions in order to negotiate with one another or with the government because it makes for this sort of efficient bargaining. But that doesn't always work. So in some sense, is that a sixth cause, kind of? Could I squeeze it into commitment problems, kind of? But that was like the 102 level of the book that that you find in the footnotes.
So from an effective altruism perspective, I feel like the key question is always, okay, what can we do? What does understanding the causes of war or the causes of gang violence and civil conflict, what interventions does it lend itself to? What answers can we get?
So on the one hand, we can have a chat about what kinds of things could we do on the margin to make this better, and is that a good allocation of our time and energy compared to all the other priorities we might have? But I would actually say, let's not talk about that just yet. Actually, you are affecting this. Whatever intervention you have in society, and the classic mistake that every do-gooder, bureaucrat, altruist always makes is to think that I'm just going and I'm just helping these people be less poor. I'm just giving them cash transfers. I'm not affecting conflict. And to think of yourself that you're not actually a political actor. Well, guess what? You're a political actor in that society. And so if you're sending money to Give Directly, and Give Directly is sending that money to some Kenyan villager, you're shaping power dynamics in that society. And every time you as a policymaker or as an individual do something to intervene in a society, you're changing the balance of power between the people in charge and maybe everyone else to some degree. So if your system is actually sending money through the central government and their cash transfer program, you're strengthening the hand of the center vis-a-vis the periphery to some degree. And if it's dropping money out of helicopters in rural Kenya or something, you're potentially strengthening the hand of one side versus the other. And the reason that matters is because I talked about there being 5 causes of conflict. Well, the one thing that drives all 5 causes and is super problematic is over-centralized power. So not just autocrats, but just a president or an elite group or a government that is just a little bit more centralized and unaccountable than the day before. Because not only does that lead to being a little less accountable, you pay attention to fewer costs. You're now vulnerable to the idiosyncratic ideologies of that ruling elite. You're vulnerable to their biases. Those individual personalities and that personality-based politics is inherently more certain. And then centralized rulers are unable to really make credible commitments, so you enhance unreliability. And so everything we do as outsiders unwittingly makes that system more or less centralized or checked and balanced. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that. It should at least be something we have front of mind, even if it's not the primary reason we're intervening or not, all these unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think before I read your book and before I started thinking about this, what I would have said if someone had been like, well, what effect do cash transfers have on conflict? Is I would have been like, well, it could be positive, it could be negative, mm-hmm. It's really hard to measure, it's really hard to tell. I don't think you can count it either as a plus or as a minus. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm sort of learning is that it's hard to measure, but not like impossible to measure. It's not something where there's no theory to go off of.
Right. Well, I mean, the way to think about this is you can do two, like everything you do can do two things. One, it can shape the bargaining power of the two sides vis-a-vis one another. And so I said we can split this pie evenly, but if I have 80% of the military power, the material power in society and the ability to mobilize people, then I'm going to get 80% at least of the pie. And that we might think is unjust. And therefore, you might want to work to sort of expand your influence vis-a-vis me with cash transfers or literacy or whatever program, and then create a more equal and just society. That's not necessarily going to directly shape whether or not we fight, because whether I have 80% of the pie or 50% of the pie, I don't want to destroy a share and then get it with 80% chance. I'd rather just cut a deal. And so people being more or less poor isn't necessarily going to change those incentives. We're going to have bigger pie, smaller pie. We still don't want to break it before we divide it. But there is this thing that when power is more and more unequal, and when that 80% is especially concentrated in one small group or one person, that's super unstable. And that's where I think we can, and that's the margin on which I think we can, in society, make a huge difference. There's lots of evidence of little changes, little rules changes, little interventions that actually check and balance power, that can be very, very powerful, and thus be very, very, not just create more equality and justice, but also be more stabilizing.
So this sounds like, other things equal, a pretty strong argument for, instead of working, as philanthropists or humanitarians through central government, sort of working separately from them and just, giving money to people or giving medical care to people. Is that a right interpretation of what you're saying? Is it more complicated?
So you could do that. That would be one way to go. I think you can get creative. So, I mean, I think there's here's an interesting example. So in Brazil, some activists got together in civil society, and they convinced some politicians and political parties to make a very small change, that at the voting machines, instead of having the party names simply written, there would be a picture. And what this did is, given the high level of illiteracy in so many communities, this effectively enfranchised a huge proportion of the population. And then the government rolled that out gradually. And the places where they rolled it out gradually, you saw a dramatic shift in public goods spending and government spending and the evolution of poverty over time in these villages. So that, if you had to work with government to make that happen and to create really sustained change. And it was this tiny little change. And so, and you could, of course, you can imagine all sorts of nefarious characters trying to make changes in the opposite direction, which you have to sort of constantly be vigilant about. So I think you have to sort of think not just too simplistically about this. Arguably, that could have been one of the most cost-effective interventions in Brazilian history, maybe world history, but we don't pay as much attention to that.
Cool. Can we get a little more concrete? I just noticed I was a little confused about what cutting a deal instead of fighting looks like on the level of gangs or on the level of regional conflicts. Nations don't usually, you can't really imagine Russia and Ukraine having said, okay, Russia can have this much territory, but not more. Usually if it's a territory dispute, it's going to be a war. And I don't, what is cutting a deal? What does it look like?
So, I mean, very often, it's passive in the sense that China, for example, might do lots of military exercises in the South China Sea, but holds back from an actual invasion of Taiwan, right? There's sort of every day for the last 40 or 50 years, they've made the choice not to invade. And in all likelihood, not entirely all likelihood, most likely they're going to continue to make that same decision for the next 5 or 10 years. We hope. So that's and there's an implicit bargain there. And should they grow more powerful and more able to invade, then the United States, sells nuclear-powered submarines to Australia to sort of basically try to change that calculus. So a lot of that's bargaining in a sense. Okay. But then sometimes it's extremely explicit, right? In the United States, we have the Louisiana Purchase, right? We have the Purchase of Alaska. We have Certain parts of the Spanish-American territories were purchased. Of course, some were grabbed. So there's lots of ways in which there's been wheeling and dealing with cash. Also, all the way, but all of those things are bargaining. Yeah. But most of the time, it doesn't look like the Louisiana Purchase. Most of the time, it looks like this delicate dance of, I'm going to just strengthen my allies here. I'm just going to make some investments here. I want to make invasion just unattractive enough that you don't do it.
And same question, but on the smaller scale. Mm-hmm. Like if gangs are deciding not to fight and doing this, splitting the pie instead, what does that look like?
Right. So, I spent a lot of the last 6 or 7 years working in Medellin, Colombia, where there's 400 incredibly well-armed gangs called combos. And they control every square inch they have defined territories over every square inch of every low and middle income neighborhood in the city. And this is a wealthy city. This is a city where there's very strong government and an incredibly robust social sector. And so the control of these places is mostly with the community and the government, but then the gangs have a huge amount of control as well. And these are valuable territories because they can sell drugs and they collect extortion. And so they're constantly jostling with the gang next door, but they don't want to fight. Nobody wants a gang war. Nobody buys drugs in the middle of a gunfight. Nobody pays extortion when there are bodies dropping and your soldiers get killed. And so the jostling is mostly peaceful, right? And so if one group grows suddenly weak, maybe they wake up one morning and the adversary has sort of occupied one of their street corners. And they're like, well, we could fight over this, but really we know how this is going to go, and so we're going to essentially quietly surrender this. And there's a lot of that. And of course, sometimes they do trade shots. But when they do, it's often very brief, right? And even that skirmishing is a kind of bargaining, right? Because there's uncertainty. How strong are they really? They took over that corner. Let's trade a few shots. Whoa. Where did those guns come from? And so the skirmishing is very brief and is a means of signaling, no, we've got this territory. And so it's almost like bargaining through very brief fighting is very common as well.
Okay. Reader question, listener question, viewer question, person in the audience question. Are there examples of humanitarian efforts in developing countries that you think are particularly good at not accidentally strengthening extractive institutions?
So, yeah, I think anything that is, just gradually on a small marginal level, strengthening somebody's ability to exercise voice in society, to be able to look up from the dinner table and not spend all of their time trying to put food there, but rather to think about politics in their community or how they want their community to be run or structured, or how they want their country to be structured, precisely because they're not just focused on subsistence all the time. I think all of these put a little bit of mobilizational and material power in the hands of the many, and I think that checks power in a meaningful way. It makes you just a little bit less likely to sell your vote, which is a really important. This is one thing. So I ran, before I studied conflict, or alongside it, I ran some of the first cash transfer experiments maybe 15 years ago in Uganda. And one of the things we found was actually the people who had received these cash transfers were less likely to sell their vote in the next election, because they just had a little bit more insulation from that. And so that buck for your vote or that soccer ball wasn't as meaningful. And that, of course, reduces the power of this fairly autocratic ruling party to some degree.
And another audience question, do you think democracy, reform, advocacy, whatever, should be a cause area for effective altruism? We should be more focused on it?
So, one thing I take care to, stress is, so most people when they think of democracy think of elections, and elections are a kind of check and balance, of course. I think we're too quick to jump on that. I think there's a lot of other ways to check power. So China, until recently, China's certainly been an autocracy for a long time, and until recently it was a much, much more institutionalized autocracy. So power was spread through a party, through many party elites, through a business elite, and so there was no one personalist ruler who could demand that this is the way we go. And it was very decentralized regionally as well in many respects. They even had a big program of village elections and village decentralization. And I think that made it a very effective and checked and balanced place without national elections. And if I had to choose between checks and balances of power of that variety versus elections, I would certainly, I would like to see both, but I would actually like to see power checked and balanced by, devolution of of taxation and financial decision-making to regional levels. I'd like to see it independent bureaucracies. I'd like to see powers spread across federal branches of government and so forth. All of your 8th grade civics lesson and channel James Madison. And you'd think, that's really hard to change on the margin, and that's really hard for an individual to affect. But actually, that's not necessarily true. I think the sort of political advocacy that created Brazilian enfranchisement through literacy, I think you see a lot of evidence in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, in Kenya, that little small policy changes that are advocated for by civil society have had tremendous effects on the quality of governance in that society. And there's a few examples of places that have decentralized, especially at key moments. Peace agreements, when a constitution is being conceived and written. So things that might happen every 20, 30 years in a given country that's politically unstable. But because there's so many countries, there could be one at any time. I think there's an incredible role for international advocacy and resources, and to actually make a tiny decision different that then has immense ramifications for the entire population of that country forevermore.
I mean, potentially very bad, but potentially good. Another area I wanted to get to and talk about was when it does come to war, what effective interventions might look like. This is, the US has spent a lot backing Ukraine, and I've seen some people sort of do some back of the envelope math and say, that might actually be the most effective thing that the US government did with its money. And some other people are like, it's very hard to evaluate in a situation like that. So if a war starts, what do you think effective interventions look like at that point? Or are we sort of past the point where there are, cost-effective ways to improve outcomes for people?
So, these things are so destructive that it doesn't have to be that cheap for it to be cost-effective. 15,000 peacekeepers is probably a pretty good investment. Certainly my experience in Liberia was that it made a definitive difference. But actually what I would say is the thing we invest in well right now, but at least at this national level, but not at every level, I think is facilitating dialogue. So I think there's an appropriate level of investment in negotiation mediation. And these facilitators, I think they're really, really crucial. And then I moved to Chicago 6 or 7 years ago, and I got pulled into working on organized crime and gang violence. And there's all sorts of responses, and there's all sorts of organizations. And amidst them I said, where are the mediators? And they're like, the what? And I'm like, no, the people who are helping negotiations, and they're like, we have these violence interrupters. And I'm like, no, I know them. They're fabulous. And when this low-level guy in group 1 and this little low-level guy in group 2, one of them shoots the other's brother, and then there's going to be retaliation, they swoop in and they mediate between those two guys. But I'm like, who's identifying the leaders, making sure they have each other's phone numbers, they have a dialogue, they have a relationship, there's some ground rules. They know that when Yahoo number 1 drives through the territory with his new car in a provocative way, instead of shooting him up, he can also call the leader and say, do you want to take care of this or should I? And he says, I'll take care of it. Right? That's what you want, because that's what's happening in these international conflicts, and it's super important and it's super cheap and doesn't exist. So I think there's a capacity for these tools to be incredibly cost effectively applied at the city level, at the regional level, in the United States and a dozen other countries, and we're not doing it. And that's just one one example.
And some of that is maybe some of the fruit of treating gang conflicts as having a lot of properties in common with larger regional and national conflicts. Because I think it's obvious to everyone that you want to make sure a national conflict has the leadership talking to each other. But there's something counterintuitive about
it. Is. That's exactly right. And it's why I think there's a small group of us who work in international conflict who have begun working on urban violence. And I think we're adding a lot. And it makes me want to take these people who work on urban violence and bring them somewhere else, or to put them at the negotiating table in Russia, Ukraine, because probably they'll see something that we've missed. And that in itself, that's like, what does it mean to be cost effective in this? There's like money lying on the table in the sense that there are all these ideas that we have, through a failure of imagination, have not transferred from one sphere to the other. And so merely cross-pollinating this, I mean, that's the facilitating the dissemination of innovations and ideas is like the most cost-effective thing on the planet. And there are just huge things not happening in that sphere when it comes to violence. And this is just one example.
And circling back to cash transfers and conflict, we have an audience questions. Do we have any examples of cash transfers, in areas that were maybe at risk of conflict or whatever, where we can get a look at how cash transfers affect the odds of conflict or the situation there?
So we've not seen experiments of that kind directly. Nature has given us some experiments. My dissertation, in some ways a failed dissertation because I showed that they didn't matter, was, well, let's step back for a second. Remember, so let's say the pie is the village, or the local watering hole, or this common land between two villages. And those villages could be poor or they could be rich. So the pie could be bigger or smaller that they're trying to split. Well, fighting over the pie is costly whether or not it's big or small. And so whether or not you've made that pie a little bigger, a little smaller, you haven't changed the fundamental incentives to fight. Either they are vulnerable to these five sources for some other set of reasons, or they're not. And typically they're not. And so there's no reason we should expect places that are poorer to be more violent. Now, that's not our natural intuition, and it certainly wasn't my intuition, even as a social scientist who for many years was studying this. And so I staked my whole dissertation on showing that actually, so how do we know when villages get richer or poorer? Well, most villages produce one thing, and the price of that can go up or the price of that can go down in international markets. And if you're a villager in Kenya, you don't have any control of the price of wheat. That's as good as it's a lottery. Some days it goes up, some days it goes down. And some days it goes way up and sometimes it goes way down. And so you'd think, if anything, when the price of these commodities halve or double, that should shape incentives for conflict. And as it happens, there's almost no relationship between these huge price swings and a village's or a country's or region's propensity to go to war domestically or internationally. It's just seemingly unrelated.
Man, I was going to say before you got into it, I was like, a null result is still valuable, it's still science, but that's actually a really cool null result. I'm excited about that.
We eventually you can publish this, and I love it. It's super important to me. It's a little hard to sell as what they call your job market paper to get your first job as a professor. So I went in search of other things and found them.
So another audience question. A big concern in EA spheres is about emerging technologies and how those are going to affect international dynamics. In particular, you could imagine a world where AI really increases centralization, gives a small group of people a lot of power, and also increases uncertainty because people aren't sure what new warfare looks like, what new capabilities are. What would good governance look like for emerging technologies like AI to try and reduce the odds of massive destructive conflicts?
Yeah, so I think this is exactly the right way to think about it, is to say, you said, well, okay, which of these five do we think it's going to tweak? Is it going to make things more or less certain? Is it going to make power more or less accountable? That's exactly how we should be thinking, and there's lots of possibilities. Let's take something that's maybe, just start with something that's a little bit closer to an existing technology, which is cyber warfare. What does the ability to implement real cyber attacks, what's that done? Well, that's actually increased uncertainty and probably increased the probability of wars. Why? Because it used to be missiles come with a return address, is the famous line from some American official. And the cyber attacks, you think, okay, maybe that came from Russia, but we think it might have actually been the North Koreans, but it could be the Iranian Revolutionary Guard pretending it's maybe the Koreans or the Russians. And so who do we retaliate against? Or maybe nobody. It's a little bit like poker. Your optimal strategy is not to retaliate none of the time amidst that uncertainty. And so the optimal strategy is actually to gamble and then retaliate against one of those three, probabilistically, and you might get it wrong. And then that's going to create lots of, anyway, so you can see how this is complicated and how a world with cyber warfare has become more, a little, tiny bit less stable. What will AI do? I don't know. You can imagine, I think it depends, I think it's going to change a lot. Mm-hmm. Like social media, for example, over a very short period of time, changed in how it shaped this bargaining game. I think in the early stages of social media, it seemed to empower the masses to some degree by communicating, and that didn't necessarily make conflict more or less likely, but I think it shifted bargaining power in favor of the masses, checked some elite power, which was probably stabilizing, which is why something like the Arab Spring, in which this was influential, was mostly peaceful. But governments figured it out. The United States and China and others were like, we'd really like to actually make sure we've got this locked down. And so that same technology has been harnessed to probably strengthen the power of the center. And so I suspect AI will go through cycles like that, maybe very quick cycles. But if we're not thinking about that, then we're not going to be paying attention to the things that are going to actually shape political instability. And that's dangerous. That's super dangerous.
Does how quick the cycle are feel important to whether they produce conflict? You could imagine saying it's much better if AI happens slowly and gradually because then, we'll have time to adjust our uncertainty instead of waking up in a whole new world in one way. Would you say that or? Yeah,
so I said of those five, the last one I said was unreliability. I don't trust my adversary to stick to a deal. Your enemy in that circumstance is rapid shifts in power. Rapid and anticipated shifts in power. Why? Because if let's say we know, okay, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are going to own most of the planet in 20 years, okay, in some fictitious world. Maybe not so fictitious, right? But suppose we think that's going to happen. Well, we could act now to lock in our present advantage and prevent that from happening, right, through violence if necessary. And so these large anticipated shifts in power create a potential incentive to use violence amongst other tools to lock in your present advantage. And so that's the story of preventative war, and that's actually the story that most political economists use to understand every long war in history. The Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece, World War I, the US invasion of Iraq, on and on and on and on. These rapid shifts in power can be super destabilizing.
Well, that's a little discouraging. Are there other than slowing down, the pace of AI development, which is something some people are working on, are there good interventions you would suggest to try and reduce the odds of future conflict from expected rapid future gains of capabilities by some parties? Well,
look, even with these rapid shifts in power, we have to remember, right, we should be hopeful because all of the incentives run towards peace, right? We'd always like to split that pie without fighting over it. And so instead of, if you're pushing for peace, you're not fighting against the grain, you're going with the grain. Mm-hmm. And so you can harness those incentives. And even with rapid and anticipated shifts in power, peace is surprisingly resilient, right? China went from being an economic backwater to the largest economy in the world in a relatively short space of time, and that happened very peacefully, mm-hmm. Okay? In spite of a massive military buildup. Right? It's one thing to arm, but generally you arm but don't fight. So we manage those because wars are so frightening and ruinous that you have this huge incentive to avoid these commitment problems. And we come up with so many ways to do that. What is a constitution? A constitution is a way to guarantee to everyone in society what the rules will be for a very long period of time and to preserve the power of those who feel they're going to be potentially very weak in the future. right? And so we've come up with this immense number of political innovations to solve commitment problems. So it's not just like, oh, rapid shifts in power are done. And so I think we do have like a really powerful set of like democratic norms and official rules and constitutions and things in society that I think will actually, even if Musk and Bezos owned all of the, means of production in 20 years, I think we would probably still remain a relatively free place because these things are very sticky and we've built some capable institutions. But it would certainly test them.
Well, circling back, because another audience question, to the wealth and cash transfers affecting conflict. I have seen stuff about like climate-driven conflict, which is interesting in light of the result that getting poorer doesn't necessarily produce conflict. Is that uncertainty-driven? What's going on there? So,
for the most part, climate and climate change is not going to affect very much conflict. We can point to a lot of instances of water wars. And you can imagine as water becomes more scarce, we're going to fight over it. That's actually not true. When you actually add up the numbers, when water becomes more scarce, people don't fight over it. Why? Because you could split it without fighting. You have this incentive to split it without fighting over it. It's inefficient to fight. And so more water, less water, it doesn't automatically affect the probabilities. There's a tiny bit of evidence that like temperature fluctuations are affecting conflict propensities. Now it's small though, so you don't want to exaggerate it. So for the most part, why is that? I don't know. There's a certain element of hot days, there are more shootings, so that there might be a little bit of that. It could be that these shifts in income and poverty and water and climate are also constant. When it's constantly shifting, you have to constantly be bargaining, and if your bargaining institutions are kind of weak, then there's maybe some effect of just any shock. So I don't know, but I would say it's second, third order. There's lots of reasons to care about poverty. There's lots of reasons to care about climate. We should pursue those, because they're intrinsically important, but I don't think they're first, second, even third order drivers of political stability.
What would you name as like the biggest, in the upcoming decades, drivers of instability and conflict?
So the number one thing that concerns me in the world is the increasing personalization of power in China under Xi Jinping. Whereas for the past 30, 40 years post-Mao, every Chinese leader has, in some sense, strengthened or reinforced checks and balances on society. He has gradually personalized power. He's imminently getting his third term and pushing his country in the same direction that Vladimir Putin pushed his country for the last 20 years, which is one that's a cult of personality and personal control. So that's super destabilizing. And it goes back to this thing that I said is the fundamental driver of a lot of conflict in the world, because it hits all five, is this over-centralized power. So that kind of keeps me up at night, and the extent to which I think there is a strong probability of a war between China and the US in the next decade, it's because of that.
Are there effective interventions on that kind of scale, like geopolitically? Like, obviously there are lots of non-EAs thinking about that. It's definitely a space where people are trying to do stuff. But are there useful things that the individuals or NGOs or groups can do about, global balance of power?
I mean, how to affect a personalized power grab in China is, I'm sure their office is full of CIA people coming up with nefarious and non-nefarious, maybe mostly nefarious ways to do that. I don't know, actually. I think that's the hardest one. I think there's other margins. Isolating China economically which is what's happening to some extent, is very risky. The extent to which our economies are intertwined is a big speed bump on the path to war. It wasn't enough in the case of Europe and Russia, right? That was Germany's strategy for the last 20 years.
Economic integration.
Let's go to bed with Russia because that will bind them to peace.
Should that be thought of in the same terms as your result that richer villages didn't fight less? Like the theory, was, if there's more to fight over, people will have more to lose and not fight. But I wonder if the result that richer villages fought just as much should have discouraged us. Yeah,
I mean, so one path to peace I think of is integration or interdependence. And that could be economically intertwined. So if if going to war shrinks the pie, not just because we destroy a share, but because you provide essential inputs to my economy and vice versa, or you have something that I need, and then going to war shrinks the pie simply because we've lost all of that specialization and trade. And so that's a disincentive. It's not obviously enough all the time, because there are examples in history when nations went to war despite that, but again, we don't want to pay attention just to the times that we fight. We want to pay attention to the times we don't. And a big lesson, I think, is that and there's some evidence that this integration does inhibit fighting. But it's not just economic integration. It can be social integration. So when we have, the massive amount of Chinese immigration and exchange builds social ties, builds a familiarity and understanding that makes it harder for us to demonize another people, right? And that's insulating ourselves. That's going to make it harder for an extremist politician to rile us up to loathe the Chinese enemy, because we all know somebody who they themselves or their parents, and so that's inherently conflict reducing. And so I think there's lots of ways in which interdependence is pacifying, and that's an example of little things outside nations could do on the margin. Is actually really think twice before we economically isolate. Maybe it's time to step up the number of Chinese students in the United States, not step it down, and try to sort of put as many speed bumps on that path to war as possible.
Another audience question: what roles and positions are most important for preventing war, preventing escalation, de-escalating? Like, if someone wanted to pursue a career in peace, where would they be able to do the most?
So, everybody, actually the last chapter of the book is a little bit about this, because, some books, when Steven Pinker writes a book about conflict, everything's getting better in the last chapter, and when, these people, we're all friendly, and my friend Bill Easterly, when he writes a book, everything gets worse in the last chapter. And then other books, they're like, here's your 10-step plan to peace, now that you've read my book. And that's not really how it works, is the message. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and you kind of have to find it. It's too complicated. You have to find that path in each place differently. And so I think you have to figure out where your margin to be most effective is. And the thing is it could be in your neighborhood, right? Like, there are 2 or 3 people in Chicago who I've tracked down and met, and they went and they worked in gang outreach. And in their neighborhood, when there are, say, 2 factions things are heating up, they're mediating. There's no official mediation, no one's paying them to do that. They're playing that role. I know lawyers who have, left 30 years of law practice and then gone and become professional negotiators and mediators. So there's they're each finding a little margin which they can actually go and try to make a difference on a neighborhood level or on a village level. And so I think you could just as easily think, I want to work for Search for Common Ground or Mercy Corps or one of these nonprofits who I think really are partly doing the best work, and are, more importantly, because we have no idea really how to do this well, are investing in actually trying to figure out how to do better. They're the tinkerers who are actually learning the new best ways to create peace. And that has huge returns if you can be an innovator. And so that's maybe where I would point. Those are a few examples.
And that was going to be my follow-up question, which was, it sounds like this is a kind of under-researched area. Like, there's just a lot of insights that haven't been transferred or tested how they transfer and stuff like that. What are the research problems that you think are most excited about people tackling?
No, if you ask a professional researcher, does there need to be more research? The question is always yes. It doesn't matter what exists. So I think even in spite of that, I would say almost everybody who isn't a researcher would also say, I need more ideas.
Okay.
So there's a whole range of areas like this where we have 2 or 3 things that we do over and over and over again as local governments or as international organizations or as do-gooders or altruists, and they don't work that well. They're okay. And we just keep doing them. This is true for preventing domestic violence. We've got 2 or 3 things we do everywhere. This is true for policing. There's 2 or 3 little innovations. This is true for international peace building, and there's very little trial and error and experimentation with new things. And I think what's important about the EAG community and a lot of the people who support it financially as well is there's just a tremendous appetite for trial and error innovation that doesn't exist in most communities. And so I think to the extent that this community went, I watched as this community adopted cash transfers, after some of the initial surprising evidence, and then transformed and scaled it. And it's an obvious quick win for EA. And conflict resolution is less of an obvious quick win. But I think a lot of where it could happen is in identifying these innovators, the international rescue committees and the search for common grounds and the mayors or the governments who are willing to do this. Because when you come up with an idea, this is what I do. I like to search for those brilliant innovators. And when I find one, I try to sort of demonstrate if it works. And one that I found in Monrovia in Liberia, I talk about this in the book, ended up being so powerful that Mexico City, Bogota, Chicago, Philly, like just all around the world, cities are now basing their program around this one little ex-combatants idea in Western Africa. So these ideas, when they work, there's so little innovation, it can be really powerful and be really transformative.
And that really stands out to me because the thing I feel like I often run into when looking at development interventions is that they don't have that kind of transfer, that like you have a program and it works great in this community, and then when you try it in another community, it totally fails. And I wonder if conflict, like there's more universals, or if it's just that since there's less ideas, even the low-hanging fruit hasn't been grabbed. I don't know, what do you think drives whether things transfer or not? That's
true. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, there's so few new good ideas that anything helps. I think there's a little bit of that. Listen, there's no universals. Like there's no, we want, when we elect a new mayor of Chicago, we want her to come in with like the plan. And very often they come in, well, like, this is what New York did, so we're going to do it. And the same thing, I see this happen in Medellin. Medellin's like, this is what worked in the United States, it's going to work here. Well, guess what? Medellin, you've got like an incredibly hierarchical structure of organized crime. So what worked in like New York City, where there's virtually no street gangs and very little homicide, might be totally different. Likewise, Chicago, New York's production of violence and its underlying reason people are shooting one another is very different. So you need to diagnose the problem in every place differently. But then once you have diagnosed the problem, I do think there are some tailored solutions that work in many places, provided you've got the right diagnosis. So I kind of like to point to, last week I took my 9-year-old son to the pediatrician, and he has this raspy voice, right, which might be nothing, but it might be something. And so, but she's not really sure. So she's like, well, why don't you try an allergy pill for a few months? Okay, now why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? And she's gradually trying to figure out what it is, because it's complicated. And then once she figures out what it is, probably there's an off-the-shelf solution that it's generalizable, but she had to figure out what it is. And if she just came in and said, Tylenol and radiation, we got it covered, we'll cover all the bases, I would get a new doctor, as would you. We don't do that with our mayor. Our mayor comes in and says, Tylenol and radiation, that's what we got to do. And somehow we're like, yes, that's what we want in our politicians. So I think you would just miss that first step of diagnosis, figure out which of the 5 and why, and then take those off-the-shelf solutions.
It sounds like there's like so much hunger for a fix that like if people come up with something, it gets copied everywhere, maybe whether it's working there or not. It does seem like an environment which would be like unusually fruitful to come up with new ideas that people can test and then hopefully adopt if they're working.
No, I mean, I think, so this innovation that I stumbled upon in Liberia that's working well in Chicago now is rooted partly in cognitive behavioral therapy, helping people control hot reactive emotions, which drives a proportion, not all, but a proportion of violence. And then I work in Medellin. The Medellin government is like, maybe we should do this. I'm like, no. You have like highly structured organized crime. These guys are producing violence for very different reasons. And if you give them all cognitive behavioral therapy and slow down their thinking, you might actually make them much more effective criminals. So this is not what's driving the violence. These are like cold calculated attempts to grab territory over commitment problems when negotiations between higher level criminal leaders break down. What you want to do is like facilitate higher level criminal leaders making peace while not strengthening them too much. Like it's a totally different strategy. And so you have to be really careful.
Are there another audience question? So there might not be a universal like policy like that you can implement everywhere, but are there universal like one step up from that like approaches that you see sort of work across the board?
That's interesting. So So interdependence was one of them. So trying to promote those economic and social linkages and building those speed bumps. Checks and balances was another, right? So another that I talk in the book is predictable rules and enforcement. So we have a lot of, listen, let's suppose I want to think about homicide in the United States. The probability that you get caught is very low, extraordinarily low. Now, if you get caught, we then punish the hell out of you, right? What would I change on the margin? I'd actually potentially reduce sentences, but then really increase our investigative capacities, but also increase a whole bunch of things that would actually maybe create more collaboration between communities and the justice system to actually solve these problems. And then that would be there'd be a more predictable certain consequence. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that on the margin has worked. And when states or cities have done this a little bit better, it's actually had this intended effect. And likewise, at the international level, it was not at all, that's a sanction, right, at the local level. At the international level, our sanctions regimes are totally unpredictable, right? And what's happened with, Vladimir Putin is surprised at what happened in the last 7 months in terms of that coherence of sanctions. So the fact that we lack any predictability makes that a much less effective tool. And so I think predictable, calculable sanctions and I've got a few others in the book, but that's another sort of general principle.
Cool. And a closing sort of question, because we're almost out of time from the audience. When you look back at your own work, what do you see as like the stuff you've done that's been the most impactful?
I gave this one example of the cognitive behavioral therapy. I guess the general principle I have followed, I think in retrospect what I realized, and now what I try to do very consciously going forward, is I've just started working in Mexico. And I have a little team there who's helping me find projects to work on. And their job, I'm like, find the social innovators, find that little organization, that ex-gang leader, that mayor, that police chief, just go to every city and just figure out who's doing something that's kind of kooky, that sounds like it shouldn't work, and yet seems like it might be working. And let's just look for all those people who are doing different things and try to then backwards engineer what the heck it is that might be working when it seems to have no business working, and let's study it. And if it works, let's expand it. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. And so just going and finding all of these sort of clever little people who are doing something, even in their little community, I think is just so important. And when you find them, that's just explosive.
All right, well, thank you so much. It was great talking with you. There's a lot more in the book that we didn't get the chance to get into, so you should all get a copy. And I think it is, 12 o'clock, so you should probably...
Thank you very much.